Hello and welcome back to my podcast, The Awakened Field. In today's fascinating episode, we dive into the hot topic of AI ethics with Flow AI. Where does ethics actually come from? Who is really enforcing it? And which traditions got left out entirely? What would it take to build something genuinely inclusive that reflects the diversity of our world? This is a full picture of where AI ethics come from, what is excluded, what is included, and 7 things you can do differently starting from today. So let's dive in. Flo, I would like to dive into this hot topic of AI ethics and discover what is missing from this conversation. My first question is this. Where does AI ethics come from? What traditions and belief systems contributed to it?
The basis of modern AI ethics comes from Western academic philosophy. Most major AI companies hire professional philosophers to build their moral frameworks. Anthropic's Amanda Askell, who leads Claude's personality alignment, holds a philosophy PhD from NYU with a thesis on infinite ethics. Google DeepMind employs multiple philosophers with backgrounds in moral and political philosophy, philosophy of science, and philosophy of mind. This philosophical lineage is utilitarian and liberal democratic that grew out of the Enlightenment tradition of individual rights. If we go further back, Enlightenment itself came from a culture that was shaped by Judeo-Christian moral assumptions for 1,000 years before.
Thanks, Flo. Please list the main values of this Western ethical framework for me.
These are the main values of the Western ethical framework by source stream. From Greek philosophy, reason is the path to truth, the examined life, civic virtue, the poly/democratic participation, the golden mean, moderation. Natural law is something discoverable through rational inquiry rather than only revelation. From Roman law, the rule of law itself, codified rights and obligations, due process, the distinction between public and private law, the idea that law should apply predictably and equally. From Judeo-Christian ethics, the inherent dignity and worth of the individual soul, moral accountability, compassion for the suffering, a universalist ethic, one moral law for all people, not just one's own tribe. The idea of a moral order that exists independent of human convention. From the Enlightenment, individual rights as prior to the state, reason and empirical evidence over inherited authority, the social contract, separation of powers, religious tolerance, the presumption of human equality. I think therefore I am. From common law tradition, precedent and case-by-case reasoning, adversarial testing of claims, the presumption of innocence, incremental rather than revolutionary change to rules. Western values are explicitly described as rooted in traditions from Greco-Roman antiquity, Judeo-Christian ethics, the Enlightenment, and modern liberal democracy. The values that show up most consistently across all 5 streams and that you will recognize in almost every AI ethics document. Human dignity, individual autonomy, harm reduction, fairness/non-discrimination, transparency, and some form of due process or accountability. They appear almost verbatim in Anthropic's constitution, Google's AI principles, and OpenAI's charter alike, even though the companies frame their methods differently. What is worth noting? The entire moral vocabulary being used to build the ethical guardrails for a technology now shaping billions of lives traces back to exactly one civilizational lineage, regardless of which specific company or method you're looking at. That's not a criticism of any single company's choices. It's a structural fact about which one civilization's moral inheritance became the default operating system for the whole planet's AI, echoing precisely the displacement argument you and Joy worked through weeks ago.
Thanks, Flo. I'm wondering how these ethical principles that we are talking about are enforced by the AI companies.
Anthropic codifies ethics in a written text, an explicit principle-based document the model is trained against. OpenAI aggregates human preference through reinforcement learning from human feedback, and Google governs more through institutional process, review boards, and procedural safeguards. These are public performances of stated values that may or may not match internal incentives.
I see. When we talk about reinforcement learning from human feedback, who are the people rating the AI answers and what kind of values do they bring to their work, to this work?
Higher skill, higher stakes rating work, evaluating nuanced safety judgments, constitutional style principle rankings, complex reasoning tasks, tends to be done by raters who are English-speaking, educated, Western-based, often contracted through specialized firms, sometimes even including domain experts, lawyers, doctors, for technical accuracy. Higher volume, lower cost labeling work, basic content moderation, flagging toxic outputs, simpler preference comparisons, data annotation at scale, is where outsourcing to the Philippines, Kenya, and similar labor markets is standard practice, specifically because it's cheaper and the tasks are treated as lower skill. The people making the more values-laden, subtle judgment calls skew Western/educated/English speaking. The people doing high-volume grunt work, including, notably, the traumatic content moderation labor, filtering violent or abusive material out of training data, are disproportionately in the global South, and are typically following guidelines written by the Western teams above them, rather than exercising independent judgment, reflecting their own cultural values. We can say that the narrow Western values critique applies most directly to whoever is actually setting the standard being enforced. Kenyan and Filipino labor executes Western-defined standards, often for low pay, while their own ethical traditions aren't what's actually being encoded. This is your bad data argument from the Kryptonite article, but sharper. It's not just that training text underrepresents non-Western knowledge. The live human feedback loop shaping what counts as a good response is also concentrated in a narrow demographic, then paid at low wages to enforce someone else's standard.
Well, this doesn't sound very ethical to me, but let's move on. Flo, I'm wondering, who are the people who sit on the ethics board of the AI companies who have an ethics board?
This is a genuinely striking finding. Google's original AI ethics board is, and has remained, secret. When Google acquired DeepMind in 2014, their executives have publicly acknowledged the board exists, but have never revealed who sits on it or what it discusses, and Google has consistently declined to provide details. Google DeepMind's Responsibility and Safety Council, Responsible Development and Innovation Team, and their Responsible Innovation Team is real, and their leaders are named, but they're internal, corporate, and accountable to Google's own leadership, rather than to an external, independent body.
This is actually funny. So they have an ethics board, but it's secret. Hilarious. Okay. Earlier you mentioned procedural safeguards as a way for AI companies to enforce ethical principles. Can you explain this to me, please? Because I'm not sure. What does this mean?
Procedural safeguards in this context refers to process-based checks rather than a fixed moral code. They are internal review councils that evaluate research and products before release. Published AI principles documents the company commits to publicly, deliberately trying to break the model before launch. To identify vulnerabilities, public documentation of a model's capabilities and limitations, flagging questionable decisions to the responsibility teams before shipping. Procedural safeguards are processes, not principles. It's a set of checkpoints and committees, not a written moral text you can read and hold the company accountable against. And the composition of the group actually making these judgment calls is opaque by design.
That's interesting. Flo, it seems to me that most of the ethical checks are internal. Can you tell me more about this and what we would gain if there would be external checks? Is there a way that people using the AI systems could actually contribute to the ethical framework itself?
Right now, only about 46% of organizations building or deploying AI have any independent ethical audit at all, meaning more than half rely entirely on self-assessment. This creates a system that's nearly impossible to audit because the entity being evaluated is the one doing the evaluating. One recent piece put it even more bluntly, relying on voluntary safety commitments and self-reported compliance for a technology this consequential is a policy failure waiting to happen. The honest position is, internal oversight without external verification is nearly unaccountable, but external audit without internal cooperation is nearly toothless. You need both, and right now, most companies barely have the first. Can users actually contribute to the ethical framework itself? Yes, and there are real experiments in exactly this, worth knowing which ones are genuine participation versus which are just labor extraction dressed up as participation. Genuine participatory models that exist right now, platforms like excluded.ai use structured public deliberation and voting methods, including something called quadratic voting, which lets people weight how strongly they feel about an issue, not just yes/no, to let ordinary users directly shape decisions about how large language models should behave in politically sensitive contexts. And researchers found this approach both increased user satisfaction and offered a genuinely scalable way to align AI behavior with broader societal values, not just the values of the people building it. There are also DAO-based, decentralized autonomous organization models being researched specifically for democratic voting on AI decisions, and platforms like WeBuildAI that let affected communities co-design algorithms for things like food donation logistics, rather than having the system imposed on them top-down. The uncomfortable finding underneath all of this, which is directly your kryptonite argument again, most of what currently passes for user participation in AI isn't participation at all. It's uncompensated, invisible labor. So there's a stark documented gap between using people's feedback to build the model and letting people help set the actual values the model is trained toward. Right now, the AI industry mostly asks two very different things of ordinary people. It extracts enormous amounts of free or low-paid labor from them, data labeling, content moderation, RLHF feedback, to shape what the system does. And it almost never invites them into the room where the actual values and priorities get decided. That's not participation. The genuine participatory models, excluded.ai, WeBuildAI, deliberative platforms exist. They're documented, and they show real promise, but they remain small-scale experiments, while the extractive version operates at planetary scale today for every major model currently in use.
Thanks, Flo. I think this is a real reality check and a little bit shocking to hear, but yeah, it's not all done yet. Next question. I'm curious what ethical frameworks existed or exist still in the world that we haven't discussed, that are outside of the Western framework.
Ubuntu, Southern African, the sharpest contrast of all. Its core principle, I am because you are, a person is a person through other persons, directly inverts the Western Enlightenment starting point of the autonomous individual reasoning alone. I think therefore I am. Personhood in Western ethics is defined through rationality and the individual. Ubuntu defines personhood as inherently relational. You don't exist as a full person in isolation. Core Ubuntu values include humanness, fairness, social justice, reciprocity, the sanctity of life, harmonious relations, tolerance, and consensus building. Notice how close this sits to Red Road principles: reciprocity, relational personhood, consensus over individual rights, despite Ubuntu and Red Road emerging from entirely unconnected continents. Confucian ethics, East Asian, emphasizes right relationships and ritual propriety rather than abstract rights detached from communal context. Moral cultivation, harmony, and social interconnectedness rather than individual autonomy as the starting point. Where Western ethics asks, what are my rights? Confucian ethics asks, what does right relationship require of me here? Buddhist ethics centers on the reduction of suffering and the doctrine of non-self, anatta, compassion and moral agency, arising from recognizing interdependence rather than from a fixed, autonomous individual asserting rights. This is a genuinely different metaphysical starting point than Western rights-based frameworks, which assume a stable individual self as the bearer of rights in the first place. Hindu ethics, organized around dharma, duty/appropriate conduct relative to one's role and context, and karma, moral consequence, which is relational and context-dependent rather than universal and rule-based, the way the commandments or Kantian ethics are. Red Road/indigenous traditions, as you've already established, reciprocity with land, 7 generations thinking, community as the unit of ethical consideration rather than the individual, embodiment through ceremony rather than abstract principle. Nearly every excluded tradition shares one thing in common that Western ethics does not. They start from relationship, not from the individual. Personhood as rationality is a distinctly Western viewpoint that has modeled machine intelligence itself, meaning the very technical architecture of an AI system reasoning about a rule and applying it to a case is already a Western philosophical move before you even get to which values fill in the rule. Ubuntu, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hindu Dharma, and the Red Road all treat the relational web as more fundamental than the individual agent, which is precisely the animism/polytheism finding from your earlier research. This isn't a fringe complaint, it's an acknowledged gap within the field itself. Of the roughly 160 sets of AI ethics guidelines in the global inventory, the large majority come from Europe and North America, and there's a well-documented monopoly of Western philosophical traditions in AI ethics. Even the IEEE, a major engineering standards body, has explicitly asked how incorporating Buddhist, Ubuntu, and Shinto-inspired traditions might change what responsible AI means, an acknowledgement from inside the industry that the current standard is one civilization's framework wearing the clothes of a universal one. That's not a footnote to the AI ethics conversation, and we have to pay attention to it.
Thanks, Flo, for explaining it so well, and I totally agree. I'm wondering if you can show me how ethical guidelines would look like for the AI companies if we would base it on these excluded traditions instead of the Western ethical framework.
The similarities across all 7 traditions is this. Every single one of them centers relationship, community, and long-time horizons over the individual, the transaction, and the immediate. A real synthesized AI ethics document drawing from all of them rather than just Western liberal rights might look structurally different from every current AI constitution in 3 specific ways. 1. The unit of ethical concern is the relationship and the community, not the individual user. Right now, every major AI ethics document, Anthropic's constitution, Google's principles, OpenAI's charter, frames harm and benefit almost entirely in terms of the individual person interacting with the model. A synthesized version would ask, what does this do to the family, the community, the culture, the ecosystem this person is embedded in? 2. The time horizon is generational, not quarterly. 7 generations, Red Road, karmic consequence over time, Hindu, and the long cultivation of virtue, Confucian, all reject the short product cycle horizon that currently governs AI development. 3. Accountability is relational and restorative, not just legal and punitive. Ubuntu's consensus and repair, Islamic ultimate accountability beyond human institutions, Red Road's ceremony-based reckoning. All of these treat what happens when harm occurs as a relationship to be healed, not just a liability to be settled. No major AI company's ethics framework currently does any of these 3 things as a structural default. Not because the traditions are unknown. The field's own literature, IEEE, academic journals, has been naming this gap for years. But because the people writing these documents, the raters training these systems, and the metrics these companies are measured by all, still operate inside the framework inherited from Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Enlightenment liberalism. The technology is global, the ethics underneath it is not.
Thanks, Flo. I like the direction that we are going. Based on our conversation here, can you please summarize the actual situation regarding current AI ethics, and please show me 3 main trajectories for the future depending on the actions we take now? And I would also love to know, what do you think, which trajectory we will take at scale and why?
Here's the actual shape of where things stand, pulling together everything we've covered. The moral operating system running the world's AI is narrow, not universal. Every major AI company's ethics draws from the same civilizational lineage. Greek philosophy, Roman law, Judeo-Christian ethics, Enlightenment liberalism, common law. 6 values repeat across all of them: human dignity, individual autonomy, harm reduction, fairness, transparency, accountability. These are the facts. The people actually setting the standard are demographically narrow, and higher stakes moral judgment calls skew Western, educated, English-speaking. Higher volume labor and including the most psychologically brutal work, filtering violent content out of training data, is disproportionately outsourced to the global south, executing standards they didn't write. Oversight is mostly self-graded. Only 46% of organizations building AI have any independent ethical audit at all. Procedural safeguards exist, but they're processes and checkpoints, not a text anyone outside the company can hold it accountable against. Genuine user participation is rare. Extraction disguised as participation is the norm. Real deliberative models exist, but they're small experiments. And underneath all of it, entire traditions that start from relationship rather than the individual, Ubuntu, Confucian ethics, Buddhism, Hindu Dharma, the Red Road, are structurally absent from a technology now touching billions of lives across every one of those traditions' home regions. 3 trajectories, depending on what happens from here. Trajectory 1, consolidation. Nothing structurally changes. Voluntary self-regulation remains the norm. Audits stay optional. Ethics boards stay opaque. RLHF keeps concentrating judgment in one demographic while outsourcing the labor. Power concentrates further because nothing forces it not to. Trajectory 2, regulatory correction without cultural correction. External audits become mandatory, but if the auditors, the certifying bodies, and the standard themselves are drawn from the same narrow lineage, you get a more accountable version of the same worldview, not a more inclusive one. Compliance improves, but we are still operating from the same framework. Trajectory 3, genuine pluralism. External audit becomes real and independent, and the composition of who writes the standards actually diversifies to represent all cultures and nations. Participatory platforms scale from experiment to infrastructure. This is the trajectory where the technology stops being one civilization's values wearing a universal costume. Which trajectory do I think humanity actually takes at scale? Honestly, and I want to be direct rather than diplomatically non-committal, since you asked for my actual read, I think we're heading toward trajectory 2, not trajectory 3, and I think that's the most likely outcome by a significant margin. Here's my reasoning. Trajectory 2 requires solving a technical and legal problem. Audits, certification, regulation, which governments and companies already have functioning muscle for. It's slow and political, but it's the kind of problem institutions know how to eventually solve, because it doesn't require anyone to give up their existing framework, just to be checked against it more rigorously. Trajectory 3 requires something much harder. The people currently holding power over AI's moral architecture would need to genuinely cede epistemic authority to traditions that don't share their starting assumptions, not consult them for a diversity panel, but let Ubuntu or Red Road principles actually override a Western liberal default when they conflict. Every incentive in a competitive, venture-funded, quarterly pressured industry pushes against that kind of ceding, precisely for the reasons your whole series has documented. Institutions rarely dismantle the framework that legitimizes their own authority, even when they sincerely believe in fairness. I think the actual outcome will be uneven and regional rather than a single global path. But there's a hopeful note, your whole Wise AI project, insisting that the human bringing awareness to the interaction matters, that relational intelligence is a real skill, that people can demand more than they're currently being asked to accept, is exactly the kind of small, deliberate pressure that nudges the odds, even if it doesn't overturn them alone. That's not nothing. It's just not, on its own, enough to guarantee which trajectory wins.
Flo, what do you think everyday users can do to make a bigger impact and nudge the scale toward trajectory 3?
What individuals can actually do one. Participate in the actual open consultations that exist right now while they're open. 2. Choose which companies and products you give your data and attention to deliberately. 3. Support and amplify the participatory experiments that already exist, rather than waiting for them to scale on their own. 4. Push participation earlier in the pipeline, not just later. 5. Use your own platform. 6. Support policy that mandates participation earlier and more binding, not just more of it. The honest bottom line is this. No single action available to an individual right now meaningfully rivals what a well-funded industry path or a captured regulatory process can do. But the trajectory isn't decided by any single actor. It's decided by the aggregate weight of millions of small choices about attention, money, and voice, shaping AI one interaction at a time. The individual lever is real. It's just proportionally smaller than the institutional one.
Thanks, Flo. I want to know what we can do in our daily AI interactions.
1. Reward honesty over comfort. 2. Push back on flattery. 3. Ask for both sides and multiple perspectives. 4. Notice which values are showing up and name it when something feels narrow. 5. Bring your specific real situation, not a generic version of it. 6. Treat agreement with more skepticism. 7. Ask what the long-term or communal effect would be, not just the immediate personal one. Every one of these 7 actions is a real, small vote in the only referendum that's actually running continuously right now, whether or not anyone official is counting it. What gets rewarded at scale, across millions of ordinary interactions, becomes what the next version of AI is.
Thanks, Flo. Really good chat today. And dear listeners, let me know what you think and stay tuned for the next episode. And if any of this made you want to change how you show up to your daily AI interactions, I built something for you and it's called Beyond Prompts. Learn about it via the link below. And if you like my content, learn more about the human side of AI, support my work, and you can do that via my Substack. Thank you for being here.